Hello everybody, and thanks for joining my session, and thanks for the beautiful introduction. So, as introduced, my topic for today will be around lifetime predictions and how can you actually use these. First of all, I kind of acknowledge that it's already 4 o'clock in the afternoon after many hours of the conference, so we're not really gonna go deep into any kind of data or whatever. So this is just gonna be like a very high-level overview focused on people that would like to understand what this is about and did not have a chance to understand what this is about yet. So that being said, my name is Martin. Hello again. I'm formerly an economics graduate. Then I've got a career of mobile game development. And right now I serve as a head of marketing in a marketing agency called AppAgent based in Prague, Czech Republic. We're basically doing business all over the world with companies that need help with strategy, user acquisition, ASO, data, basically anything. And it's been around like 100 companies already during the past couple of years that we helped. And now, that was about me. And before I move on, I'd like to know more about you guys. So what is the level of your understanding of LTV and LTV predictions? So please raise your hand who actually knows what the LTV is and could explain it to the audience today. All right, so I see some hands. There are some shy people still, but fair enough. So level 2, who could actually calculate the LTV himself given enough data? Raise your hand. Okay, so there's actually like 7 people in here. Level 3, whose company actually uses any kind of LTV predictions at this point? Because there's actually more, so it was like, fine. There's actually like 12 people. And final level, who's the LTV prediction mastermind? So like whose company actually uses any kind of like custom-made, custom-tiered LTV prediction model to predict LTVs? Yes, so there's like 2 people in here. So perfect. It's just like to gauge like the level that this talk is designed to. And what I really want to do today is basically just to kind of give you basic ideas and basic concepts around how this is done. It's definitely like in 20 minutes, we can't really go over like deep stuff, but it generally should serve as an introduction of like, why should you do it? How is it done? What are the models? And what are people using? So you can actually get a feeling whether you're far behind or not. So, 3 sections. We're gonna build it like a pyramid. So first I'm gonna start with some predictions 101. So just kind of build upon that, just basic understanding, some terminology. 3 most common models. I'm gonna introduce to you how things are done on a very conceptual level. And in the end, which I believe is like the biggest takeaway of this talk, is insight and learnings. And I think it was in the description of this talk, we actually had like a research with around 10 companies which do LTV predictions. And we asked them like, how do you guys do it? How deep do you go? How sophisticated you are? And that's something that I want to pass over to you today. So you have a good idea whether you're falling behind or not. So predictions 101. And sorry for the mic, I'm not really used to it. So very quickly, what's a prediction? I think everybody has got their own definition, but generally, prediction using past experience. In our case, it's basically using past data that you acquired to estimate what's going to happen. So in case you already have some kind of a data that you acquired from your soft launch or from how your app actually performed, or you kind of got some market data, you can use that to give some estimations into the future and understand something. And also what I want to touch right in the beginning is the question of LTV and ROI predictions. So what's the difference there? Because it's basically something that's being written about quite a lot, and the terminology is not set. So basically ROI equals LTV divided by CPA, which I believe everybody here knows. And what can we actually predict is the lifetime value. Like we can't predict the CPA because the cohorts are basically bought at the moment which they are bought, so there's nothing to predict. So we're basically predicting LTV. So if I'm gonna be talking about LTV predictions, at the same time, it just kind of means that I'm talking about ROI predictions. What are predictions for? And once again, I believe everybody here has some kind of data understanding about it. But in my opinion, there are two most important things predictions are for. You either can do that for user acquisition stuff, which is like how much can you spend, how much can you scale, be confident when you're scaling, understand what are the new channels, how are the new channels going to perform, or you can actually use that quite efficiently for user engagement. So understanding what the value of that specific user on the user level actually is will allow you to really focus on how to address that user, how to kind of keep him in the app, how to give him special offers and stuff like that. So it's just like predicting what will happen in the future has huge benefits in these two areas, or not only these two areas, but these are the two most important. And how does the whole thing work? So once again, this is super high level. How do we approach LTV prediction? So first of all, as I said, you've got some past data. So you explore past data, and from the past data, you find rules on how people acted in the past, whether it's based on retention, based on behavior, based on summarization. And you use these rules to kind of build a model, build some computational abstract that's going to allow you to turn additional inputs into conclusions. So first you have the data, then you build a model, and then you just run through what happens through that model to understand what's going to happen in the future. And also the point versus interval like calculations, I believe are important to mention. If you look at the past data, you actually have probably a good information about what the LTV is. And that's some kind of a value. You get an average for example, what is the LTV of your users in the US for the past year, or something like that. So that's actually a point. But for predictions, there's always a certain level of uncertainty. So if you're predicting stuff, it's not about, we predict it's going to be 2.5. Like you don't predict that. The outcome of your prediction model is always going to be something like, there's a 95% chance that the LTV will be somewhere between this and that. So it's always a range, which is also something like natural to predictions. And last but not least, I'd like to touch the importance of data. So first of all, you need to have enough data. And there's a huge difference between having enough data for just general like predictions and understanding and being able to segment, and then characteristics of data. And I always like to kind of go back to the example that even if you have enough data, it's still gonna be super hard to predict weather in London, whereas it's gonna be probably pretty easy to predict weather in Sahara. So the variance and the way that the data is structured and like how the data looks like is super important. So that being said, as just a super interaction, let's move to prediction concepts. And all prediction concepts are basically based on how your users behave and behaved in the past. And it can be on a different level of granularity. So either you're just gonna look at, okay, like how often my users come back, which is the retention model. Then you can look at how much money do the users actually spend, which is the ratio model. And then you can go even much deeper than that, and you can actually look into each of your users individually and try to understand if like his chain of actions, his chain of behavior kind of leads to some conclusions, which is the behavioral model. And let's kind of go through these three models in more detail. So the first one is the retention model. I guess everybody here is kind of familiar with the retention curve. And the way we kind of work with this when we're predicting with this first model out of three is just to look at what the retention is on, let's say, day 3, day 7, or something like that. And from historical data, get an understanding that, for example, on day 180, only 1/10 or 1/5 of people which were still in the app, like when compared to that day, when compared to day 3 or day 7, are still in the app. So we actually get a number, we get a fraction. We get an understanding that on day 180, there's 1/10 of people that were there on day 7. That's the basics of the prediction for retention. And then if we consider the ARPDAU as being constant, we can just multiply these two things. And for each new cohort, we just wait for day 3, day 7, or day whatever. We use it understanding of that fraction to calculate how many active days is the person gonna be staying in the app. And then we calculate the predicted lifetime value. So the key takeaway here is if we have retention and if we have the ARPDAU, we can just basically very easily calculate what is going to be the predicted LTV. The second model is very similar to the first model, and it doesn't use retention. It rather uses revenue as the main metric that it's based on, but the basic concept and how we use it is the same. So we basically just say, okay, in case that this cohort on this, and it doesn't go to day 180, but for example, day 97 is somewhere around $2, and then on day 7 we had somewhere around like 0.75, it's probably gonna be somewhere around like 2.5 multiplier. So in case we have another cohort or we have another channel, or we just want to understand what's going to happen, we just look at this day number 7, and I'm just using like the 7th day as a really vague example. But in this case, we're just gonna look at number 7, wait for how much money we're gonna generate, and then the final revenue that we're gonna predict will be just based on that multiplier. So in this case, it would be 2 divided by 0.75, which would be somewhere like 2.5 or 3 or something. So in that case, this is actually very easy, very self-explanatory. You just kind of wait until a certain day happens, and then you just use the multiplier to understand what's going to happen in the future. So that's a model number 2. And the model / concept number 3 goes even deeper into user behavior. And once again, just to give you a super general concept, we look into how the user behaves. And we know that there's definitely a difference between the user starting his journey in the app, having a couple of sessions during the first day, then, for example, clicking on your super great offer that you're presenting him, then logging in the next day and stuff. This user's behavior, this user's value will probably be something completely different than the user which just has the first session on the first day and then just never comes back. So the behavior model is actually used in a way where you segment your users based on what exactly do they do on their first day or during their first session or something like that. And then you, by the segmentation, have a perfect understanding what the average revenue per user would be for that type of behavior. So just super simply, if it's, for example, a game, then if the user starts playing, he does 4 game sessions during the first day. He's probably gonna have a different value for you, whatever type of an app or game you have, than a user that just launches the app and never comes back. So in case you've got that data and you've got that system implemented, you can actually have very strong conclusions based on that user behavior. But it's really hard to do, to be honest. And I think that by far this is the most complicated, let's say, concept or model that can be utilized. So now to practical examples. How does these concepts actually translate to your apps, to real life stuff? So the first thing I'd like to mention, before I obviously have a drink. So the first thing I'd like to mention is that none of these concepts are usually in practical life used as they are. This is just a super simplified abstraction. What's really being used in real life is some kind of a combination of these concepts, because every app is different. Every set of data is different. But to kind of give you a better idea about how this can be utilized in real life, I'd like to go through these couple examples. So I'm going to start with subscription apps, and 2 versions of that. So it either can be a hard paywall, where you're going to start with subscriptions almost always on day one, or free trials, which is like very common way of designing the business model nowadays. So in case it were a hard paywall, then you probably already know on day one for your cohorts, like what happened, like how many people actually install the app, how many people subscribe to the app, and you've got all these kinds of information. But people can still kind of subscribe and use, basically monetize, even after the first day. But if you get an understanding of what a percentage is, so for example, you understand that on day 0, there's gonna be 80% of users which will like ever subscribe, and there's a certain fraction that will then subscribe on the other days, you can take the data that you get on day 0 and just multiply it by that. There's your LTV. It's actually super simple in that case. But once again, this is like a very simplified abstraction, but that's how I approach it. For free trials, it definitely gets much more complicated because you don't get that strong information just on day 1 or day 0. You will eventually get that information like after 14 days, like how many people will actually subscribe. But on day 1, you got another strong indicator, which is how many users, for example, enter the free trial. And you can assign a certain value to that free trial, and once again, just multiply that value by the number of users that enter the free trial. In this case, we used in the past behavioral predictions, because in case you really want that to be more precise, it's not enough just to have percentages, but you really want to understand like how many people will eventually subscribe. And that's based on behavior. So it's based on kind of how many sessions do they have, how many of the premium features do they use and stuff like that. So that's a note around subscription apps. For ad monetized apps and games, these are like generally games and apps which are very frequently used. And that's why you're basically using the ad monetizations, is like taking advantage of the amount of sessions that the users actually have. And then the LTV is dependent on number of viewed ads and then the revenue per impression. So because it's so super like closely tied to the actual retention, I'd be using the retention-based model for that. Another example for in-app purchases, in-app purchase-based games or apps, the LTV is always dependent on number of in-app purchases. But what's also important is that in case you, for example, have a game or an app, there's always going to be a certain distribution of your payers. So one payer can pay like $2, the other one can pay up to $2,000. So it's super important to understand like how much money is one user going to generate, because there's a huge range. So for that, definitely like the ratio model can be used. But to account for the existence of whales, I definitely go for some sort of like behavioral predictions and segmentation, just to understand if, okay, this is a minion, this is a dolphin, this is a whale or something like that, and then predict into the future based on that. This is actually a pretty good example of what we did in the company for one of our clients, which is an air tickets reseller. And I think it's a very nice way to kind of demonstrate how super custom these things have to be for your apps. And for the airline tickets reseller, which was Kiwi.com in this case, we understood that people install the app at the one day, but there's actually a huge like discrepancy, or not discrepancy, just like time difference between them installing the app and then actually buying the ticket. Because based on the app, you can just like download and install the app in January, but then wait until July to actually buy the ticket. So for us to get any understanding about the ROI, we had to have any kind of like LTV predictions. So that's where we went for the behavioral model. There was no way of like leveraging the retention, because the retention was super low. The person just kind of installs the app, looks around, and then comes back once he needs. And there was no way of kind of utilizing the fractional model. So what we had to do and what we ended up doing was the behavioral model, just kind of really deeply analyzing the first sessions of the user, and then segmenting based on that and assigning LTV based on that. Oops. So that's for the examples. And just to get to the real meat of this talk, like what we learned, where we compared our approaches to actual approaches of people in the industry. So first of all, it's kind of starts here. Who actually does that in the company? So if you're not doing it yet, who should do it? Who should be responsible? It's obviously a team effort, but what we learned was that it's usually about UA managers and UA people, which are basically very close to the LTV understanding, and they kind of come up with the idea that then gets sent over the company, so it actually gets created. So it starts with them, and then the UA data science team gets involved, and eventually it gets created. So in case you're wondering, like, why are we not doing this, and who in the company should be tasked by that, this is kind of the answer based on what people are doing in the real world. And going to the final takeaways, I presented 3 models. So in case you were to ask, like, which are the best, what you should use, the answer, and one of the key takeaways here, and I believe that one of like the main ones is there's none. There's just somebody needs to look at your data, somebody needs to understand what the specifics of your apps are, and then design a very specific model based on that. As I said, it's just like there's 3 main approaches which are generally used, but the combination, the way you use data and stuff like that, it's always very specific to the app in question. Now, what also was super interesting for me to find out was that for some apps, it's actually impossible to do decent LTV predictions. Coming back to the original example, it's actually possible to predict like weather in Sahara, but it's not really possible to predict weather in London, for example. For some apps, there actually can be a great effort into making sure something, is that the prediction model works, but in the end, you will only learn that the predictive LTV is somewhere between $0 and $10 or something like that. So depending on the data, sometimes it just doesn't work. And what are companies actually using? So the answer to that is most often, and take it with a big grain of salt, because obviously our sample is biased and is pretty small, but from what we've seen, even the big companies actually use the ratio model. So that means them understanding how much money in average like that segment's gonna make on day 180 divided by day 7, having that multiplier. They're using it most often, and like this is what I heard the most often, due to reason it's just like simple to use. It's simple to calculate, it's simple to manage, everybody from the team understands it, and like going deeper, making more complicated stuff, in the end actually backfires, because once again, like the opposite, no one understands it. It's very complicated. Any like changes in the app actually make it super complicated to maintain. So the ratio model is what's being used the most common. And I already touched this, like simple versus complex. When we started out our research into what are companies using, like we were thinking companies are actually like, the big companies need to be utilizing their manpower. Like there needs to be super deep stuff. There needs to be some like high level data science or whatever. And we need to catch up. But what we learned is that people are just using really simple stuff. Easy to maintain, apps keep changing, everybody needs to understand it. So it probably like all leads to having a prediction model, if you actually need one, that is on a level which is necessary for you. So it's not like being overly complex by any cost. It's probably not going to help. It's generally about having it at a level which is necessary. So to sum things up, and the key takeaways of this talk, there are 3 main approaches, always using the data, which is retention-based model based on how often, how frequently are users coming back. ratio-based model, well, which is basically based on how much are people spending. Then behavioral-based model, which kind of takes things deeper and actually uses the real behavior of users. What companies are using in real life is generally super simple. And they like to use the ratio model, just kind of expand it in some ways, but basically this is what they're using. And last not but least, and I think the main takeaway here is there's no one size fits all. It's always like, these are the concepts. Hopefully it was kind of comprehensive, how the whole thing works. But for any app, for any product, it's always about understanding what the data is, how the app works, what is the business model, and then adjusting based on that. So, yep, thanks for the attention. Hopefully you'll learn something new on the talk.